Okay, this lecture will cover the majority of part 2 of Camus' The Stranger. It won't be covering the last chapter, though. That'll be in a different lecture. But one thing is that the whole first half of this book set up what's going on in the second half. So the second half of the book begins with this sort of really surreal scene in which Mersal is in jail, but he doesn't really seem terribly affected by anything. This continues along with his general stoical attitude, and even now that he's in prison, he hasn't really changed too terribly much. So it makes you ask the question, like, why is this individual so at ease? You know, why does he seem not to care too terribly much about anything? There are some other issues that are brought up early on in part 2, such as this whole entire issue of justice and whether he's being treated fairly. For example, he's berated about his belief in God, and that brings up issues of whether his rights are violated. While he's being berated by God, for example, he doesn't even have his lawyer present, because his lawyer, wasn't there, his lawyer previously having become frustrated by the way he answered questions. There is a really sort of interesting philosophical question asked, and that's the one of, do all men believe in God? That's a particularly compelling question because some would say that no, clearly some people don't believe in God, they're atheists. But then it makes you wonder whether those atheists have just sort of supplanted something else for their God. So it's an interesting concept, and atheism is going to play a very large role in the last half of this book. So he undergoes this 11-month investigation in which he's actually called by people in the legal system Monsieur Antichrist, which brings up the question of whether that's a fair thing to call and whether he's going to be in any sort of situation to be treated fairly. It does raise the issue of whether a murderer necessarily deserves to be treated fairly, but typically, as Americans, we consider that somebody does deserve a fair trial, regardless of how gruesome the crime. In Chapter 2 of Part 2, because it starts the chapter count over again, it shows once again how indifferent Mersal is to typical expectations and the desires of others, such as when he's surrounded by Arabs who ask him why he's in jail, and he says it's because he killed an Arab. Most people wouldn't have gone so far as to be that honest. A big theme of absurdity. Absurdism is another large theme that Camus found interesting, just the absurdity and craziness and ridiculousness of life. And that's brought up in that sort of crazy scene in which everybody is shouting at each other across that distance. There's Mersal there trying to carry on a talk with Marie, who looked beautiful, but he didn't know how to tell her, which is sort of an interesting situation as well, because it brings up the issue of his masculinity and the fact that he's not, even though he's an incredibly honest individual, when he wants to tell Marie that he thinks she's beautiful, he's incapable of doing so. But there's a lot of absurdity to this entire scene, and there's also the juxtaposition of Mersal was very indifferent to his mother's death, but here there's this image of this man and this mother, standing far apart from each other in this jail time scene, just looking at each other and not saying a word. So he also, in Chapter 2, cites his mother's wisdom, in which she said that anybody could get used to anything. And it brings up the issue of, is even prison something that it is possible to get used to? There's also a particularly beautiful insight, because one thing that's interesting in the second half of this book is how Mersal, who in many ways seemed cold and emotionless in the first half, begins to have a series of incredibly beautiful and profound insights now that his freedom has been taken away from him. And one in particular is the role of memory, how he says that if you lived only one day, you could live easily 100 years in prison. And I think that that's really amazing, beautiful thought. So imagine it yourself. It's in any one day, there's so much detail, there's so much gorgeousness, there's so much amazing stuff happening around you at all times that potentially that could just, in fact, be enough stuff to think about for 100 years, if only we take the time to appreciate how much awesomeness is around us at all times. Chapter 2 ends, though, with this terrible story about this Czechoslovakian situation in which somebody ends up being killed. And it makes you wonder the question of, did the traveler deserve necessarily what he had coming to him? In Chapter 3, we actually finally get into the courtroom a little bit. And one thing that's notable is he talks about the facelessness of the jury, how he can't really even see them. That's something to consider in juxtaposition against, in Chapter 1 of the first part, how he was able to see very clearly the faces of everybody who was there to mourn his mother. So that's an interesting moment that shows a little bit of beauty in regards to his thought, in that situation he was able to see everyone super clearly, but now that he is the one being judged, everyone seems incredibly obscure. Another thing brought up in Chapter 3 is how the media chose to blow up the story and the media effects on trials. One of the largest things that happens, though, in Chapter 3 is the whole entire issue in which he actually miraculously feels like crying. This takes place when he says, "For the first time in years, I had this stupid urge to cry because I could feel how much all these people hated me." That's a really telling, profound, and amazing moment, because in this whole book he's been totally indifferent to everything, except now that the weight of everyone's eyes of hatred are upon him, he actually has an emotional response. And this also leads into the first time he realizes that he truly is guilty of his crime. Later in this chapter, we start to get the witnesses come up on the stand, discussing how he didn't mourn at his mother's funeral, but then his friends, such as Celeste and Marie, and Salamano and Masson and Raymond, all come up, but nobody really seems to care too much about what they have to say. So it brings up all these sort of issues of, is his lawyer just screwing him up? What's the deal with his lawyer anyway? Why isn't he doing a better job? Is this trial crooked? Is there anything fair? What is he being tried for? Being indifferent to his mother's death or for the murder? Does he necessarily deserve this unfair trial? And also larger questions of luck, such as when Celeste says that it was just bad luck that got him in this situation. Is there even such a thing as luck, and is there purpose in life? Okay? And that brings us to Chapter 4, the second to last chapter of the book, in which some particularly profound things are brought up. For example, there's the whole entire thing in which he says, at the beginning of Chapter 4, "Everything was happening without my participation. My fate was being decided without anyone so much as asking my opinion." Okay, so I mentioned a couple times before that in this book, everything has a greater complexity than it might initially seem. So, in this regard, you can look at that statement through the eyes of Meursault, because he clearly is in a situation in which everybody else is deciding his fate. But in a grander, more cosmic sense, do any of us ever really have any say over our fate? Or are we all just there letting our fate play out for us? Is the universe, is truth, is God, is society, are all of these things, in fact, making decisions about our fate without asking our opinion? Another thing particularly interesting is how the good traits that he had demonstrated become accusations in this particular thing, such as the fact that he doesn't have remorse. He's the type of person who he's always just sort of moving forward with things. He's proceeding in his life. He doesn't really look back too terribly much. And then when they ask for the death sentence, Meursault finally is given the opportunity to talk, and he tries to speak up, but everybody just laughs at him. So there's a lot of pointlessness to his experience here and how he can't really see what it all amounts to, and he continues to sort of fall prone to his own personal shortcomings, such as the issue of why doesn't he catch Marie's eye? And the issue again raised, is Marie a heroine or an idiot? In some ways, it's easy to see her as kind of a dummy, who falls for this indifferent person, but then sticks by him through a murder. But then she's also kind of a heroine because her loyalty is unchallenged. Chapter 4 ends with the whole entire issue of him trusting his lawyer, which might be a terrible mistake because his lawyer does seem very, very clearly overmatched. And then, of course, Chapter 4 ends with the fact that he has been, sentenced to death, and he has to deal with that. And it begins to ask those big questions of, is the death penalty itself, under any situations, a moral element? And all of this sets us up for the grand, fantastic, and profound conclusions that are going to be in Chapter 5 of Part 2, The End of the Stranger.